I'll start off with two questions for the audience. What was the first podcast that you ever heard? And just think to yourself, and what was the most recent podcast that you listened to? Yeah, I was sorry. My first was about 8 or 9 years ago. It was Freakonomics. This is all live. You guys can listen to podcasts via Blockstack on your phone, or not via Blockstack on your phone, but via the Blockstack browser on the computer, or through the web on your phone. My first one was Freakonomics. And there are some amazing episodes, especially early on, that I like to go back to for that. And most recently was Invest Like the Best by a friend of mine, Patrick O'Shaughnessy. And he has some excellent episodes on cryptocurrency that I highly recommend. So, in those 8 or 9 years, the podcast ecosystem has grown immensely. There are amazing independent creators that have really kept the independent, decentralized spirit of the early internet alive, but the technology underlying it has improved very little. Also, the economy is very underdeveloped. The technological tools are still largely controlled by Apple, who has the primary directory that lists all the podcasts. And Patreon is right now the primary way that listeners can pay podcasters. They also monetize via ads and ad networks, which are subpar. They make about, if I listen to one episode of Patrick's podcast, he makes about 3 cents for advertising on it. So what we're building at DotPodcast is an open source podcast platform our primary focus is to help podcasters get paid and to monetize all the great content that they're making, without being in the middle of it ourselves, without being in the middle of the monetization. Also, we give podcasters a way to distribute their work without censorship, and giving listeners ways to subscribe and pay podcasters while maintaining their privacy. So this is not theoretical right now. This is all stuff that we have built and that works. If you're a podcaster, you can get a listing on the decentralized directory that we built on top of Blockstack. And if you are a podcaster, you can also embed your wallet information for your podcast within the metadata of that podcast. So any browser, any open search that uses that directory pays you directly. And so that's a big step up from Apple controlling the central listing of all of the RSS feeds that we access when we listen to podcasts. You can also host a podcast with our open source code. You can subscribe using Blockstack. By using the Blockstack browser, all of your subscriptions are saved locally. And you can listen on as I mentioned before, you can listen on your phone right now. We can listen on the web. Jonathan's going to come and point out a couple of the other features that we've made.
So I don't have enough time to cover all the things we've built at DotPodcast, but I would like to cover some of the key components. The decentralized directory of podcasts, crawling and searching of that directory, subscribing to podcasts, and tipping podcasters. The backbone of the DotPodcast protocol is built on top of Atlas, which is Blockstack's decentralized naming system. You may have already registered a name against the .id namespace in the Blockstack browser, which also relies on Atlas. The .id namespace acts as a directory of individuals and metadata associated with them, like avatar URLs or social media profiles. And using the same technology, we built and launched the .podcast namespace, which similarly is a directory, in this case of podcasts. And the metadata associated with those podcasts has to do with the podcast itself. So the description of the podcast, or who hosts the podcast, or a list of episodes. What's important about this and storing it on Atlas is that anybody can register a podcast. and anybody can read that data, effectively making it a decentralized, censorship-resistant source of all podcast data that supports this protocol. Podcast player apps can directly work from this directory in order to serve content to users. But we wanted a slightly more advanced search capabilities available, so we built a set of open source reference implementations that crawl the .podcast directory, pull down all the metadata about podcasts and episodes, and index it into an Elasticsearch cluster, which you saw actually at the beginning of Bill's presentation. This enables powerful search to users without having to preload every podcast episode in the browser. And it's also totally pluggable. So if you don't want to use it, or you want to use somebody else's, or you want to spin up your own, it's completely available. So let's pick up where Bill left off. We like this podcast, so we're going to subscribe to it. And as he mentioned, the subscriptions are stored locally. In order for this to happen, the user will submit an anonymous token to the server hosting the podcast. And by default, this is totally anonymous, but it's also tunable because we want to give users the option to share more information with podcast hosts that may be useful to further customizing the content. Bill mentioned that the protocol makes it easy for podcasters to creatively encourage small dollar payments. And tipping is one of those ways that we want to encourage people to pay podcasters. He also mentioned that podcasters can easily add their payment keys directly into their podcast metadata in order to be read by player applications. We currently support Zcash, Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Bitcoin Cash, and soon we'll be also supporting the Lightning Network. Now, once a user is interested in tipping, they're only a few clicks away from putting money into a podcast host's pocket. With a single click, they can choose how much they want to tip, pocket change, maybe a cup of coffee or a sandwich, and then they can choose the denomination that they want to pay in. And this is whatever the podcaster has set up. Then they're presented with a QR code as well as links to native wallet apps so they can make payments directly to the podcaster. I'm not going to enter my password in here, but if anybody has a Bitcoin wallet on their phone and wants to pay Patrick O'Shaughnessy $8 in Bitcoin, you can use this. So there's a lot more that we didn't cover, but if you'd like to learn more, listen to podcasts, or start paying podcasters today, check out the .podcast app in the Blockstack browser. Thank you.